Chapter 22, Deception 2-4. Chapter 10, Deception 2-4, 1996, 1997. Percy is 20 and 33, Severus is 35, Harry is 16, and Dumbledore has 1 year left to live. September 1996. Percy impassively observes as each student's luggage is taken apart, examined, and assembled again. Each student displays his bare arms and submits to a check by McGonagall before being turned over to take the carriages to the school. The process is lengthy, even with the aid of the auras that Scrimgeour pointedly sent with Percy to assist. Draco gives Percy a long, unreadable look when it is his turn. His luggage is, of course, pristine, and his arm perfectly bare. Percy cannot see the circlet on his arm, but his own mark, still raw, still smarting, still alien, still branded into his flesh, gives a little jump in recognition. Percy flinches violently and has to compose his face when Julian, his assistant, looks at him in askance. Draco's nostrils flare just slightly, suggesting that whatever magic Voldemort added to Percy's circlet felt the proximity to another Death Eater as well, but he is far better at hiding the effects of the magic. The aura examining Draco gives a little hiss in disappointment, but waves him on. McGonagall's face is perfectly neutral as she turns to check Pansy Parkinson's arm. Percy waves on Theodore Nott and watches Draco go, climbing delicately into the carriage with all the good breeding of a pureblood heir. If the fact that the carriages are now pulled by the Strauss bothers Draco, he does not show it. Assuming that Draco made it to 16 without seeing someone die, Percy supposes, which is an unpleasant thought. Next is, Percy checks his list. Blaise Zabini, who came to Hogwarts with 4 large trunks and a haughty attitude. Percy waves him on as well when he reluctantly submits to the check, turning his attention to Draco, whose pale face can still be glimpsed through the carriage windows as he waits for his friends to join him. 16 years old, and with an impossible task. It occurs to Percy suddenly that the wizarding world is not particularly kind to 16-year-olds. Tom, Draco, Harry, Myrtle. Ginny will have a difficult 6th year soon if Percy does not act quickly. Perhaps the magic senses that at 16 a wizard is nearly to his majority, and thus enacts a price. Despite the exhaustion that Percy knows Draco must be feeling, exhaustion twin to Percy's own, Draco looks perfectly composed, his head held high as the crowd of young, wealthy Slytherins move quickly to jostle for a spot next to their prince. Draco looks far more the heir of Slytherin even than Tom, shorter and darker and skinnier. That makes Percy worry for him. It may be Voldemort's old fondness for Abraxas that keeps him from harming Draco, but if Draco were to appear a threat, Tom wouldn't hesitate for a second. The adrenaline from the night has worn off, and though Percy struggled to sleep, he feels surprisingly calm now that it is day. Or perhaps empty is the better word, rather than calm. The dark mark throbs hotly on his skin, and he finds himself touching it through his robes, feeling a dual urge both to stare at it for hours, and also to pretend it does not exist. He's a Death Eater now, but in a way he's been acting under the same deception for years, and while Voldemort is undeniably powerful, what Percy realized last night watching him interact with Tom is that he can be a man like any other. He is no monster, merely a murderer, and Percy has already faced off with 2 parts of his soul. After all of the students have been checked, and McGonagall dispatched to intercept the crowd of jittery first years that passed by like a cloud of mites hovering around Hagrid's large frame, Robards barks at the group of auras to spread out and check the wards on the edges of the grounds. That had not been agreed upon, but Percy had been expecting something of the sort, and likely Dumbledore as well. Percy oversees Julian cleaning up the luggage station and turns to go as well, casting one wistful look at Hogwarts. Even to be this close to its cheery warmth is comfortable, despite the chilly wind sweeping over the grounds. But before Percy can leave, Harry stumbles up the path, led by Tonks, who is looking tired and glum. Percy hasn't been able to talk to her for weeks, but he suspects her depressed demeanor is due both to the pressure of Lupin volunteering for the futile effort of liasoning with the werewolves. Futile. He reminds himself in an attempt to be kinder to Lupin, because Percy published a bloody report detailing precisely how the Death Eaters should win their allegiance, and the fact that Sirius Black has still not awoken, according to Severus. Whatever curse Bellatrix left for him as her parting gift seems to dodge even Dumbledore's considerable healing powers. Harry looks glum too, and he's sporting a nasty bruise on his face. The consolation that Percy's actions spared Black's life is not particularly strong, given that for all intents and purposes the man may as well be dead, and will probably die if they do not cure him soon. Harry and the rest spent the summer at Grimmauld Place, but Percy, despite his new invitation to the Order, has still not worked up the courage to apparate inside. Found him on the train, Tonks reports to Robards obediently. Another student hexed him. I'll walk him to the castle, Percy volunteers. Tonks gives him a cold look and very pointedly continues shouldering Harry, though she does not openly protest when Percy leaves his position at the luggage station. It's so satisfying to be senior, since Percy has a junior assistant of his own, and Julian has to step up whenever he raises an eyebrow and joins her. When they are out of sight of the Robards, Tonks nudges Harry. You be safe this year, do you hear? Harry, Percy says quickly, cutting off whatever reply Harry may have had. Seeing Harry alone is a stroke of luck and allows Percy to set into motion something that he's been thinking of for a few weeks. I need to talk to you about Sirius. Do you know Tonks' mother? Harry's tired gaze flicks between Percy and Tonks. No, he says, in the tone of someone who does not think about other people's parents. Why are you meeting with my mother? Tonks asks with a groan. She'll jump at any chance if she thinks you're interested in me. She's not Remus' biggest fan. She's serious, cousin, Percy explains, ignoring Tonks. Why everyone seems so intent to pair them together is a question for another day. At least Tonks isn't allowing the insinuations to affect her friendship with him. I think she may be able to help with his curse. I told her to speak to Dumbledore, but I'm not sure if she has. She needs permission to enter, the place in London. He didn't mention it, Harry says flatly. You've seen Dumbledore. Percy's not seen Dumbledore, although admittedly he's trying hard not to encounter the man. Harry nods warily. Yeah, he asked me to help him recruit a new professor, Slughorn. Percy only vaguely remembers Slughorn, given that the 2 years in which he taught were the 2 years where Percy remained as far as possible from Hogwarts. Why? Tonks asks, diverted from her teasing of Percy by her curiosity. You're no charmer. Harry flushes. Slughorn collects people, apparently. Didn't want to come back to Hogwarts until he knew I was Harry Potter. His voice is full of disdain, and quite frankly, Percy cannot blame him. Did Dumbledore say why he wanted Slughorn? Well, he needs a new defense teacher every year, Harry says with a shrug. Slughorn taught before, I suppose. Can't be worse than Umbridge. Look, I need to go to the castle, Percy nods distractedly. Of course, of course. They set off. Percy stops at the doors and turns again to Harry, unable to let Harry go quite yet. Listen, Harry, you know as well as I do that. Things are going to just get worse from here. He hesitates and then says in a rush, keep practicing defense, do you hear me? Tonks nods seriously. Don't worry about Sirius, we'll sort him out. Practice your magic, Harry. You know I'm not one to nag, unlike the pants next to me, but it's true. You lot will all need to know how to defend yourselves. Keep the going, Percy adds. Tell Cedric. Harry looks between them again, and then nods roughly before separating himself to attend the feast. Percy watches him with the same trepidation that he watched Draco, though nobody has taught Harry a glamour charm to mask the exhaustion that spells itself out so clearly on his young face. Percy supposes he wasn't supposed to talk to Harry, given that Harry allegedly trusts him too much to pretend otherwise if asked, but Percy doesn't know why Dumbledore would think that. Certainly Ron hasn't liked Percy since he was 11, and if his own brother doesn't trust him, his brother's best friend is not likely to think otherwise. Tonks turns to him as if she's going to say something cutting, but then her hair flickers grey, and she merely sighs. I'll try to see you in London soon, she says tiredly. Bloody hell. Give the werewolf my regards, says Percy, both to see her roll her eyes, and also to remind her that she should not appear too friendly with him. I just don't understand why you don't trust Dumbledore, exhales Tonks in a gust of irritation. It's Dumbledore. Do you really think Dumbledore would hesitate to sacrifice you in a second if doing so served him well? Percy asks, raising one eyebrow. Tonks, to her credit, does not immediately protest. Well, I imagine keeping everyone in the Order alive does serve him well, so I should be safe, yeah. Funny that he hasn't awoken Sirius, nor helped with his curse, Percy points out coolly. It most definitely would behoove him to have Sirius alive, so that Dumbledore is the de facto head of the Order's headquarters, and Harry won't try anything reckless, not with his precious godfather dependent on Dumbledore. Funny that he doesn't help Draco, even though you and I both know he's not evil, and he's stuck in an incredibly precarious position. Tonks begins to protest, and Percy holds up one hand to forestall her. Look, Dumbledore is a good man. Of sorts, he thinks uncharitably. I'm not trying to argue that he isn't, but he's the general of his own army, and so he has to make sacrifices according to his battle plans. I have no intention of being one of his soldiers, and the best way for me to keep out of his plans is to keep out of his notice. Tonks looks at him soberly, and in her gaze Percy sees her mother. Tonks is so young, though she's older, of course, than his physical body is now. He holds his breath, hoping he won't have to strike down one of his only friends. I hate this, mumbles Tonks, turning her body half away from him, as if insulted. Percy is sure nobody is close enough to hear anything, and anyway, he's raised the appropriate protections against eavesdropping. But anyone could glimpse their bodies, outlined by the stark moonlight. All this waiting. If we're truly in a war, we should be fighting battles, but Scrimgeour won't call it that, even though we all know better. Percy hums noncommittally. I'll see you soon, he says, and walks away from her with brisk, abrupt strides. But her words play on his mind as he makes his way home. Perhaps he's not the only one feeling constrained to act, and it is true that Scrimgeour, for all his bluster and private indignation at the state of affairs, seems cautious to act. Perhaps he is considering the limited size of the Auror forces, particularly after a raid on the Nut family goes poorly and 2 Aurors die in the fight. Perhaps he believes that the work of a minister is to procure foreign allies and elicit the support of powerful wizards like Dumbledore. Perhaps he has plans he does not share with Percy, which would not surprise Percy too much, given he doesn't think Scrimgeour ever thought very highly of him. Though Percy does not speak directly to Moody, he can see that Moody is taking action of his own. More than once, Percy stops by the Auror office to see the desks all but deserted, the squads down in the training gym underneath the ministry, drilling in relentless preparation for the raids that are to come. Percy reads the papers every day, but he cannot tell if the losses reported on both sides are higher or lower than they would be without the joint actions of these 2 men. But despite Percy's nominal inclusion in the Order, things seem to be proceeding right on schedule. That is, until Percy wakes for the 4th night in the row in the middle of a scream, his throat as raw as if he'd swallowed one of Fred and George's pills and thrown up for hours. For a long second, Percy sits upright in his bed, wand clutched in his sweaty hand, eyes flicking around the room to look for the enemy his body is convinced is nearby. For a long second, he is torn, half of his mind still in the dream, in the great dark ballroom of Malfoy Manor, the Muggle man in front of him, Percy's spell tearing him to pieces. Except it had been Percy facing himself, his red hair glinting like blood in front of him as the magic swept through his body, and took the ultimate price for his arrogance in believing he was anything other than a useless squib. Strangely, oddly, unexpectedly, Percy dreams of the death of the Muggle much more than his murder of Bellatrix Lestrange. The latter had seemed inevitable, excusable, even admirable. Certainly both Severus and Tom, the 2 ends of his moral spectrum, had complimented him on the act. As Percy manages to wrench his mind away from his nightmare, his heartbeat stuttering oddly against his chest, as he realizes that he is in his bedroom and he is safe, he feels a tremendous urge to cry. Despite what Severus had said, Percy had thought that killing a Muggle would be easier than killing a wizard. Percy cannot remember the very first chicken he'd ever helped to kill, though he is sure he felt strange about it at the time, perhaps holding its squirming body with trembling hands as his mother aimed her wand at it grimly. Percy didn't lose any sleep over the hordes of gnomes he'd kicked over the fence, abandoning them to forage for shelter outside the protective embrace of the burrow's lawn. He'd spent years of his childhood catching frogs and fish and snakes before he'd professed to grow out of it. The mice did not sit heavily on his consciousness, and though he'd returned the cat before trying his hand at it, he does not think he would have endured nightmares over its pitiful cries. But the Muggle, perhaps Percy's fixation on the event, was due to how vividly awful it was, the sight of the golden lights flashing through the man's body, only to cluster at the ends of his organs and pull them with vicious force. Perhaps Percy wakes, screaming, feeling that his own skin is on fire because he knows in his heart he had not had to kill the Muggle, but rather chose to end his life for his own rewards. But shouldn't his subconscious know that to refuse to kill the Muggle would have certainly been more dangerous than if Percy had ducked his head back under the desk in the Department of Ministries and let Bellatrix kill Tonks and Sirius? Fine, he thinks to Severus uncharitably, grumpily. You've made your point, has he? Whispers Tom quietly. Percy shudders and drops his wand, burrowing back in the sweaty tangle of blankets. Yes, but even acknowledging that yes, perhaps Muggles are the same as wizards, magic notwithstanding, does little to quell Percy's horror whenever he thinks of the events of that night. Even when his own magic sparks down his skin, it makes him shiver, imagining the power that has been at his fingertips for his entire life, turning on him viciously. His inclusion in the nightmare is new. Percy has dreamt so often of the Muggle man that he can remember every detail of the man's face, of the strange checked pattern of his shirt, of the round shape of his ears. But to see his own face staring mutely back at him, to see his own body crumble into ash, he does not get very much sleep the rest of the night. Perhaps that is what is to blame for what is truly a reckless act. The next day, after ensuring yet again that most of the auras are on another one of Moody's training exercises, Percy makes his way down to the holding cells in the Ministry, an area unpleasantly familiar to him for his time working under Umbridge in the war. Now, before the terrors truly begin, the cells are largely open, creaking intermittently as a gust of wind down the winding cells rattle the bolts in the large metal doors. He holds his breath, as became his superstition in the last war, so as to not breathe in the smell of unwashed skin and blood and tears that lingered so persistently on those sad, helpless Muggle-borns, and pushes through to the room beyond where, as he'd suspected, 3 large Dementors float in the center of the room. Percy inhales sharply as the mist curls toward him. Faintly, he hears the sound of screams, feels the raw, jagged feeling of Fred's death. But strangely, the horrors of the last war seem at times to pale in comparison to the misery of his current life, whether because the distance in time has blunted their impact, or because in this timeline he has seen more horrid things than before. Percy is able to firm his grip around his wand and take a deep, steadying breath, his nose wrinkled at the wretched, rancid smell of the Dementors. His Patronus is still rather unreliable, but in his other hand, he holds one of the portkeys he'd made to transport himself back to his flat. I wish to speak to you, Percy calls out into the echo of the room. His voice does not waver. I need your help. For a second, nothing happens, and Percy begins to mentally curse himself in his head. Of course, the Dementors are classified not even as beings, but as magical creatures. They do not have coherent thought, unlike centaurs. Why had he thought this is a good idea? Then the biggest Dementor dispatches itself from the others and floats slowly down until it is hovering in front of Percy. He tenses, palms sweaty, but the flood of terror he expects from proximity to the Dementors does not crash over him like a wave. No, all of the fear he is feeling is entirely justified and entirely his own. What help do you require, worker of the Ministry, sounds suddenly in Percy's head, and he jumps in surprise. Voice does not sound human, nor like a male or a female, but it is recognizably a voice, and Percy can tell it comes from the Dementor. The Dementor looks at Percy steadily. This close to it, Percy can see the faint outline of its face, the thick, dark, mottled flesh, and the suggestion of 2 eyes and a mouth. He breathes in deeply again, feeling a bit faint, and then regrets it as he gets a mouthful of the wretched, rotting smell emanating from the Dementor. I want to know what you know about souls. He jumps again a second later as the Dementor's eerie laugh echoes in his mind. What we know about souls would take an eternity to relate, the Dementor says. It is our secret and our burden. Percy had not known that Dementors could speak, let alone laugh. He swallows and then tries. Is your loyalty to the Dark Lord? Our loyalty is to the Ministry while we are bound. Then our loyalty is to ourselves. Percy can't help it. He has to ask. Bound. The Dementor extends slowly a hand from under his tattered cloak. Percy tenses, but the thin, skeleton hand does not move any closer to Percy. Look, I don't see anything. This time, the Dementor's voice has a definite tinge of impatience. Look with your magic. Percy tightens his grip around his wand, but obediently breathes out again in a sorry attempt to calm himself, attempting to allow his mind to clear and feel the magic in the room. Takes him a few minutes, but eventually the panic clears from his mind, and when he looks again at the Dementor, he sees to his surprise that its wrist is bound with thin gold chains of magic. "It looks like a vow," Percy says in surprise, "like an unbreakable vow. The Ministry forced us to swear centuries ago," the Dementor reveals, and Percy knows he's not imagining the anger in the Dementor's tone. "We swore to serve the Ministry, and the Ministry swore to give us souls to guard." To guard. "I thought you, ate the souls," Percy says, flushing a bit in embarrassment at his awkward wording. "To feed." The Dementor's eyes flash from beneath its hood. "We are guardians of the dead," it intones solemnly. "We see your souls, and we absorb your fear and your terror. We watch you until you are ready to die, and then we take your soul when you no longer have use for it." "Why do we feel fear when we are around you?" "Because we feel your fear," the Dementor thunders suddenly. "Because you feel our rage. Because we have been tricked, and we cannot harm you otherwise, unless on the Ministry's command. We were given souls to guard in a prison, and we are not able to fulfill our task to take your soul to the beyond." "But you aren't always working with the Ministry," Percy objects. "I've seen you." "We are meant to release the magic within the souls when humans die," says the Dementor sorrowfully. Percy gasps. "It's the central tenet of magic, of course. That magic is neither created nor destroyed." He'd never thought about what happened to the magic inside each person when they die. Then, more forcefully, the Dementor continues, "But we soon learned we can use that magic to break our bonds. Every time the Ministry orders us to take a soul prematurely, or a human dies unnecessarily in our care, another one of us is freed." Percy staggers back, feeling sick to his stomach. "So every time the Dark Lord or the Ministry ordered the Dementors to suck out a person's soul, another one of these foul creatures was released into the world to feed without command. We do not eat your souls for nourishment," the Dementor says forcefully, as if following the train of Percy's thoughts. "But we are not content in bondage. Free me and I will help you. You do not even know what I want you to do." "I will not help you if I remain bound," says the Dementor solemnly. "I'm not going to give you someone to kill," says Percy incredulously. "You have killed before." Percy's mouth goes dry, and he trembles unconsciously as a shiver crawls down his spine. You can sense that." To Percy, the Dementor's voice sounds derisive and faintly pitying. "Did you not know that to kill is to leave a mark on your soul?" "I did know," Percy whispers, his hand faltering as it holds his wand. "I've studied souls for years, but there's so much I don't know. So much I'll need to know for my task." "What is your task?" Percy huffs out a laugh, unsure how to even begin explaining to this Dementor the tangled web of lies and obligations and burdens he has woven for the last decade. "There is somebody who has split his soul a number of times," he says carefully, "and I believe he is continuing to do so. I don't know how else to track down those pieces, so I thought to come to you." "Why come to us?" "Well, it is like you said," Percy points out, feeling defensive. "You and your kind know more about souls than anything else. I figured I may as well come to an expert." The Dementor hovers in front of him quietly, thoughtfully. "You do not fear me, though some of our kind terrorized your Ministry." Percy coughs out another laugh. How can he explain that between killing Bellatrix Lestrange and murdering a Muggle and meeting the Dark Lord and lying to Barty and apologizing to Dumbledore, that asking a Dementor for help does not seem altogether frightening? Particularly since this Dementor does not seem as if it wants to scare Percy with the terror of his own thoughts. In fact, being this close to the Dementor rather reminds Percy of all those sun-warmed afternoons sitting near Myrtle's chill, if he can ignore the smell, though he imagines she'd be offended at the comparison. "No," he admits. "I'm desperate enough to come here and ask for your help, but I understand that you don't want to give it, and I'm sorry that you've been enslaved by the Ministry. I would help if I could, I really would, but I already have one impossible task to fail at, and I am not keen to add another." He turns to go. He's 2 steps away from the door when he feels the chill of the Dementor near his right shoulder. "Souls can be sensed," the Dementor says quietly, the words appearing in Percy's mind like gently falling snow. "They can be seen. I do not know if your eyes can see them, but ours can." Percy turns eagerly back to the Dementor. "Maybe with your magic," he suggests, itching to pull out a scroll and begin taking notes. A transformative force or something like it. The Dementor shakes his head. It is not like your magic. It is something more ancient. Percy waves this aside. Dementor magic must undoubtedly be different from wizard magic. Percy doesn't think this is a particularly controversial idea. So do you think I can sense souls? Have you ever sensed your own? Percy hesitates, thinking of Tom, and then shakes his head. The Dementor is quiet for several long seconds. Percy notices the other two Dementors continue to float in lazy circles toward the top of the ceiling, as if content not to listen or interact with him. Some wizards have another form, the Dementor says finally. We find it harder to sense. An animagus, agrees Percy, feeling a familiar spark of excitement as something collides together in his mind. Yes. Animagi do not feel the effects of Dementors as strongly. We find it harder to sense, but not impossible, the Dementor considers slowly, as if thoughtfully. In the back of his head, Percy marvels at this encounter, at the way that the Dementor is so clearly capable of logic and reasoning. Is this how Dolor's Umbridge communicated with the Dementors? Did she waltz in and negotiate with them as coolly as she pleased, promising to provide them victims for their freedom in exchange for their obedience? Your soul remains within you as you change form. I can change forms, Percy says animatedly. So perhaps I can try to sense what remains the same. And anyway, when I am an animagus, I don't have magic. I've always thought souls were separate from magic, you know. When I'm a lynx, I don't have my magic, not really, but I must have my soul, otherwise I would lose my sense of self. I do not know if this would work, the Dementor says, but you may try, I suppose. It matters not to me. Well, if I'm able to sense my own soul, will you teach me the rest? Percy asks eagerly. You will have to do something for me. Percy hesitates, some of the excitement leaking from him. I can't bring you a victim, but you can research our vow. My task would have to come first, Percy explains, though part of him is itching to run off to the library immediately and look into the history of Dementors. The Dementor regards Percy thoughtfully from behind his ragged hood. Then it extends its hand again, skeletal and eerie. We have waited an eternity, and we can wait for more if we believe we will one day be freed. At the end of it, there's nothing else for Percy to do. Feeling like he is in a dream, Percy reaches out and shakes the Dementor's hand. Though Percy practices with his animagus form for the rest of the month, he cannot seem to understand what the Dementor means. As a lynx, he cannot do magic. He can smell far better than as a person, and his eyesight is strangely different. He can run without tiring, feeling his four limbs bound under him in a manner that would be completely alien to his human form. But he can still think his own thoughts. His mind is the same, and his magic must be there somewhere, if only to power the transformation back to human. But what about him is central to his being? He'll have to ask McGonagall, he decides, though he doesn't fancy explaining away why he's trying to foster an awareness of his own soul. And he'll have to ask her in person, since he can't imagine explaining his dilemma in a letter. In the meantime, the project, though frustrating, gives him a floating sense of excitement every time he clears his mind and sits cross-legged on his bed, trying to call up a sense of his own sense, to understand the central tenets of his being. It reminds him of school, of lessons with McGonagall, of the thrill of seeing his body change limb by limb into a form that had been buried inside him this whole time. It is pure, unsullied, theoretical, complex magic, and he delights in it. It's been so long since he's had a project he can exult in. Magic is might, not a question of souls, says Tom disdainfully in his head, but Percy is able to ignore it. Percy doesn't know whether Harry brought up Andromeda to Dumbledore or whether Andromeda refused to take no for an answer. Either way, she arranges to meet him at Grimmauld Place on the 4th weekend in September. When Percy apparats, there's a stretched out, frightening second where he feels the Fidelius charm evaluating him, and then the burning sting of another spell that diverts him from wherever he would have landed in the house to the only place he's been allowed access. The bedroom of Regulus Arcturus Black, former supporter and enemy of the Dark Lord. Percy looks around him with interest, but he hears the sound of Andromeda arriving and so steps cautiously into the hallway. He'll thoroughly explore Regulus' bedroom later. Now that he's successfully arrived in the Order's stronghouse, He has a great desire to investigate every inch of it, to see all the secrets out of which he'd been kept for the last 2 years. The ancestral black house is dark and gloomy and oddly claustrophobic, heavy portraits lining the walls, and every inch of available space covered in ancient-looking furniture. Percy eyes the house elf heads as he makes his way downstairs and shudders. Yes, Andromeda says behind him quietly. Not my particular cup of tea. Sirius hated this house. So you convinced Dumbledore to let you into the Order. In a way. Andromeda leads him down another narrow flight of stairs and into a dingy kitchen with a large iron stove and larger wooden table. Percy takes a seat at the table, and an ancient house elf, looking only minutes away from joining his brethren on the wall, serves him a cup of tea with a low, malicious murmur. Percy looks at the cup of tea dubiously. He wouldn't put it past the house elf to poison him, particularly when one of the elf's mutterings involves the words nasty blood traitor. After being called the opposite so often, it's a bit of a relief if he's being honest. What do you mean? Andromeda looks pleased with herself despite herself. I merely pointed out that I could feasibly challenge Sirius right to the house, given that Bellatrix has passed on and Sirius is immobilized. He capitulated quickly after that. Both Ted and I joined the Order last weekend. Percy grins despite himself. He wishes he could have seen Andromeda threatening Dumbledore. Can you? Andromeda shrugs archly. Perhaps, she says coolly. Perhaps not. But nevertheless Albus saw the wisdom in allowing me access to the Black House. With Sirius in his condition, has it worsened? Instead of responding, Andromeda merely looks at him steadily, a glimpse of her pain in her dark, gleaming eyes. She does look remarkably like Bellatrix, and Percy feels a shiver of guilt run down his spine, like a lizard scratching its claws down each vertebrae. Filthy blood, traitor heir, mutters the house elf, washing the table with a dirty rag. Do not speak of Sirius like that, Andromeda snaps back, raising her voice imperiously. The house elf flinches as the command registers, and he gives an exaggeratedly obsequious bow, picking up his rag and shuffling away. A second later, an unearthly scream is unleashed throughout the house, jarring and screeching. Percy flinches violently and raises a shielding spell without a second thought, but though Andromeda winces, she does not look concerned. What is that? Percy demands. My aunt, says Andromeda tiredly. You should remember not to raise your voice in this house, Mr. Weasley Prowett. You never know who may be listening. Andromeda's aunt turns out to be an absolutely mammoth portrait, larger than the one of Tom he is hanging on the wall. To commission, a life-sized portrait of herself would take a shocking amount of money, particularly if Mr. Barrington had been the one to do it, which would be fairly likely, all things considered. The portrait stops shrieking about intruders in her home and gives her niece an unimpressed look. Still not dead. Still alive, Andromeda says brightly. Did anyone tell you that Bella cursed Sirius and he won't awaken? The portrait sniffs. I wondered why he'd been so quiet. Bella's out of Azkaban then, is she? Good. Maybe she can restore some honor to our name. She's dead, Auntie, Andromeda continues, still in that bright, cheerful tone. Percy can suddenly see Tonks very clearly in her mother, in the high, imperious cheekbones and dark, intense eyes, the glossy brown hair that is nearly black, shared among Tonks, Andromeda, Bellatrix, and Sirius' mother. Dead, so the vault will fall to. Not you, Narcissa, then. Looks like it, Andromeda says, but her tone is significantly more brittle. But dear old Sissy is hosting the Dark Lord in her house, and by the sounds of it, her and Lucius won't last the year. Maybe you should have left some more eligible heirs, Auntie. Looks like all the baby Death Eaters won't live to see adulthood. The portrait sits heavily back in her chair, covering her mouth with shock. It can't be. Oh, yes. The black line will die out for your stubbornness, her niece bites. Oh, and you didn't hear. Regulus betrayed the Dark Lord. Regulus. This last betrayal seems to be her undoing, and the portrait begins to sob, great big painted tears sliding off her face and making a puddle on the floor. Percy eyes it curiously. How had the painter managed that? Andromeda gives the portrait a look of disgust. Let's go see Sirius. Sirius is in his room, asleep in bed, surrounded by a faintly shimmering monitoring ward. His room is as dark and dingy as the rest of the house, though with the persistent odor of sickness that makes Percy want to gag. Andromeda examines her cousin carefully, and her expression grows grimmer by the second. Will he die? Percy asks tentatively. He will, Andromeda confirms darkly, if we don't act quickly. How quickly? Andromeda looks at Percy, and understanding passes between them in a heartbeat. Their task is more important. Andromeda can try and save Sirius, but not at the expense of the Horcruxes. I would estimate 1 year from the curse's inception, she says, answering Percy slowly. This is a black family curse. It will only work if a black curses another black. What is it? Imagine a curse that can have such specificity, and people have the audacity to claim that everyone's blood is the same. Clearly, there is a difference in blood, or curses like this would be impossible. It is a curse meant for a situation like this, when one heir dares to challenge another. It is a test of wills. In this situation, the vault will be temporarily open to them both, and whoever is able to find the correct counter-curse within the vault first would win control of it. It gives the caster an advantage, of course, since the cursed might lose a few days. But in theory, it is meant to equalize a situation between two strong contenders to be the heir presumptive. My guess is that Bellatrix wanted access to the house, for some reason. Percy frowns, wondering if Bellatrix had wanted access to the house on the Dark Lord's orders. Perhaps Voldemort has tracked down Regulus too, in which case they ought to worry what else he may be investigating. But Sirius is still asleep. Bellatrix died, and someone that is not a black killed her, Andromeda says, gripping one of Sirius' limp hands. It has placed the curse in limbo. I think he would have 1 year to complete the task, otherwise he will die. Bellatrix's role in the curse does not pass to Narcissa, Percy interjects, instead of apologizing again for his role in her sister's death. Andromeda looks thoughtfully at Sirius's sleeping form. Perhaps, she says slowly, but we can't be sure. So can we go to the vault? Now Andromeda does meet Percy's eyes. We cannot without Narcissa. Who would have thought that Narcissa Malfoy would be so crucial to this war? And you think she would not acquiesce to help her cousin? Percy asks curiously. Family, he knows from experience, is meant to trump all else, even personal loyalty or political opinion. It is why Draco Malfoy can be easily forgiven for following the Dark Lord to protect his family, and Percy had been and will be so reviled for doing the same thing. You don't understand, she snaps angrily. Even without the Dark Lord living in her house, Narcissa would need to be convinced. When our parents removed me from the lineage, they did more than ruin a tapestry. Narcissa does not consider me family. So your magic no longer recognizes you or your blood? Percy asks thoughtfully. Andromeda glares. He ducks his head, an academic question for another time. We will need to get her alone, she says finally. I will speak to her. Say nothing, do you understand? Say nothing to the rest of the order. This is a private affair, and we will treat it as such. After Andromeda leaves, Percy makes his way to Regulus' room, pausing first to examine the carefully lettered sign. So like one he had inked in his very best handwriting and stuck up on his door when he was 10. The door has a sturdy brass handle with small leaf detail, a sign of the Black's wealth, he supposes, and it glows softly when Percy lays his hand on it. He can understand why Severus had suggested Regulus' room for him. He muses as he stands in the center of the room, looking around him curiously. He doubts any of the Order members would think to enter it, and even if they did, it is clear from his initial examination that the room that it has remained largely untouched since Regulus' school days. There are large green and silver hangings, tastefully draped over his bed, on the wall, and even over the windows. Far from being garish, Percy finds that he quite likes the effect, making the stuffy, ostentatious room feel more lived in, without resorting to the garish over-reliance on gold and red that most Gryffindors succumb to when decorating. Over the bed, there is a large black family crest, clearly hand-painted with care. Percy kneels on the bed, coughing slightly as dust billows where the bedding crinkles, and reaches out with a finger to trace the painted lines. He hadn't known Regulus liked to paint. Of course he hadn't known, given he knows nothing about Regulus, but the sight of the crest has the same effect as the Slytherin hangings, or the picture of Regulus and his friends laughing and waving as they clutch their brooms. It is humanizing, oddly so, and Percy feels a sudden well of sorrow for this boy, who had likely been led by his nose right to the Dark Lord. He wouldn't have had any more choice than Draco Malfoy. Less, presumably, given that Sirius had so famously defied his family to join forces with Dumbledore. Percy can't help but wonder what Regulus had done for his initiation, what his task had been, set by a younger Tom to seek revenge on the Black family for the eldest heir embarrassing an old and ancient pureblood family. On the opposite wall from the bed, Regulus had hung up a series of newspaper clippings, yellowed and crinkled with age. Percy looks at them curiously. They are all about Voldemort, of course, but he recognizes nearly all of them. He'd done the same series of research when he'd first twisted back in time, newly 11, and in the Hogwarts library, flipping through the old daily prophets, though of course these would have been more recently published when Regulus was searching. This is not a wall of adulation, as a stranger might have supposed. These papers, collected like this, show a picture of Tom Riddle's life, his movements and his triumphs. Regulus had not been pinning news of the Dark Lord on his walk for fun. He'd been researching him, and Percy would bet for the very same reason that he had, all those years ago. Somehow, somewhere, Regulus had learned of the Horcruxes. Perhaps he'd only heard of one, or maybe he'd been clever enough to investigate all of them. But somewhere, somehow, Regulus had learned that there was a way to make the Dark Lord mortal again, and he devoted the rest of his short life to the hope of success. The locket isn't in the room, of course. Percy searches it diligently, but there is nothing else of interest, only the paraphernalia of a teenaged boy. But Regulus lingers in his mind for the rest of the day, though if questioned, Percy would struggle to articulate why it means so much to him to learn of this poor, cursed black child, smart enough to discern what needed to be done, but not quite quick enough to escape the ramifications that followed. October 1996. The month of October is characteristically miserable, with loud, gusty winds rattling Percy's apartment windows each night and the tensions at the ministry rising each day. His only solace is that Scrimgeour is a fairly competent minister, and so working with him is actually a pleasure, rather than a misery. At the very least, Scrimgeour writes many of his own speeches and correspondence, so Percy has fewer pointless tasks to complete each day, though he, of course, has many more items on his planner than he would like. Percy is always scrupulously polite, responsible, and alert, as he'd been with Fudge, but for a rather different reason, and Scrimgeour seems to respond well to it, which makes Percy hope that perhaps in this timeline Scrimgeour will have cause to keep him around beyond his red hair and tenuous connections to Harry Potter. By far what comes to define October for Percy is the Dark Lord, both of them. Tom appears back in Percy's apartment in mid-October, looking exhilarated and very much alive. Percy is at his kitchen counter, preparing meals for the next week under strong preservation charms, when he looks up to see Tom watching him with an unreadable expression on his face. "Tom," says Percy in surprise. Then eagerly, "Tom, you're back. Is he have you?" "He is mad," Tom says. He holds himself carefully aloof, tension thrumming through every painted stroke of his body. Percy swallows, sets down the spoon he was holding, and walks past the kitchen counter into the small living room. Percy had, for a while, considered the idea of staying in Regulus' room, but with Tom's absence over the last few weeks, his flat had felt almost like home again. Only now does he realize how anxious he is whenever Tom's cool gaze tracks him from his perch on the wall. What happened? He is obsessed with Harry Potter, Tom says with disgust, as if he himself did not ask for news of Harry eagerly at every opportunity. He is not making any plans. His Death Eaters are unruly and lax. I would never have allowed for such a lack of discipline. I eavesdrop on them in Malfoy manner. They do not fear him as they should. He is trying to find Harry. Apparently their wands are not compatible. Tom rolls his eyes and collapses into the chair, and Percy feels some of the tension between them evaporate quietly away as they return to their normal positions. As if I would need a wand to kill a 16-year-old boy, even one touched by prophecy. The one with the power to defeat the Dark Lord approaches, born as the 7th month dies, he quotes. Seems like your knowledge of the prophecy was correct. Percy mentally breathes a sigh of relief. Then, carefully, the Dark Lord knows the prophecy. Only the same half that you learned, Tom confirms. I suppose it is possible the boy has some advantage, but I cannot imagine what it would be. He thinks he needs a new wand, which is, of course, ridiculous. He ought to focus on finding the remainder of the prophecy and then chart an appropriate action. This is a valid point. Dark Lord had concocted a plan to break into the ministry and lure Harry to the appropriate shelf. But he could have entered the ministry at any time and plucked the prophecy off the shelf himself. Presumably, the seer of the prophecy could be located, but the Dark Lord does not seem to have considered attempting to kidnap her, whoever she may be. He has no plan. He believes he will rule by fear, and fear will give him absolute power, Tom says with another expressive eye roll. He delights in it. He enjoys murder, enjoys torture. I am not squeamish, of course, but I do not murder for murder's sake. Percy privately doubts this, thinking of the basilisk, thinking of some of the memories that Diary Tom showed him, thinking of the inferi in the lake, but he sensibly keeps his mouth shut. If Tom wants to think of himself as superior than the Dark Lord, then all the better. And the Horcruxes. Tom throws a poisonous glance at the edges of his frame, as if to blame them for his inability to remove the Dark Lord himself. He's making another, he says darkly, and Percy feels something inside him freeze. He would not confirm whether he had made a sixth, but he must have made only 5 before Harry Potter defeated him. He must know he cannot survive another split. You must be correct, says Percy carefully. If the Dark Lord only has 5 Horcruxes, their task will be much easier. His mouth feels dry. There has to be some way to know how many Horcruxes exist. There has to be. Percy has been practicing his animagus transfiguration before bed, but not as rigorously as he ought to have been. He won't make that mistake anymore. It would make him too weak to attempt a 6th split. He is weaker than he ought to be, agrees Tom, sighing. The portrait runs his finger through his hair and then looks up at Percy, his eyes flashing. We need to find the locket or the cup. I may need to challenge him in a duel before the year is out. A duel, Percy repeats, taken aback. But surely you could defeat him otherwise. Could you not absorb his magic into your own? Tom shakes his head, frustrated. I believe the ritual we've planned will work only on inert pieces of soul, and I dare not risk possessing him. Find the locket, Percy. I'll keep an eye on him. Introducing Tom to the Dark Lord has the expected but nevertheless nerve-wracking side effect of placing Percy firmly in the Dark Lord's attention. He is summoned often to Malfoy Manor, and more than once he looks up to find Voldemort watching him carefully. But whether because he suspects Percy of being a traitor, or because he is interested in understanding Tom's relationship with Percy, Percy cannot say. Percy is not asked yet to participate directly in any raids. What he does have to do is, in a way, far worse. As Severus warned him, the Dark Lord seems keen to test Percy's mettle, or perhaps his capacity for witnessing violence without turning and running tail. Percy is summoned more than once to Malfoy Manor, only to be told to stand in the back, masked and robed, while a delegation of Death Eaters spiritedly torture and kill their enemies. It reminds Percy of Tom's memories, of watching Avery and Nott and Greengrass and the rest practice their magic on animals under Tom's careful guidance. But in real life, the horror is almost more than Percy can bear. And the Dark Lord watches him, often, during these times. The Dark Lord watches how he talks to the other Death Eaters, cautiously, politely, respectfully, and whether he flinches when those same pureblood heirs turn their wands on defenseless muggles and muggleborns. He watches how Percy stands, entirely still, his face as impassive as he can make it, forcing himself to emulate those steel-armored knights darting the halls of Hogwarts. Percy does not know why he is not asked to participate, but he takes it for a small mercy. Part of him finds it incredibly difficult to stand and watch. Part of him finds it repugnant to stay put while an innocent is brutally killed. But the other part of him knows that he would not be able to save any of them even if he tried. They'd kill him before he reached for his wand, and then they'd probably kill Severus next. All Percy can do is go for drinks with the Death Eaters after these horrific sessions and hear them boast and brag over pints of the finest creature-made liquors. All Percy can do is write the names of the victims and pass them surreptitiously to Tonks. Nobody has yet been sloppy enough to tip Percy off about an upcoming attack, but he hopes at least by cataloguing the dead to the best of his ability, their families will not drive themselves mad with worry. As October darkens, to give way to the imperious chill of November, Percy almost feels he may have a handle on things. He's not sleeping, not even a little. but he's figured out the optimal dose of dreamless sleep, which allows him to eke out a few hours of dozing without risking an addiction. His glamour charms are even better than they were in the previous timeline, and he is able to shove each and every sickening Death Eater evening deep into his mental library, locking them in groaning trunks with bone-white buckles, and then burying them deep beneath the floorboards. "I have been impressed with you, Percy," says Tom, and Percy shoves that down too, deeper than the chests of his shameful compliance, deeper than anything else in his library, save for the bright flash of pride he feels when he imagines Tom saying those words. Despite Tom's scoffs at the unsophistication of the Dark Lord's plan, whatever it is, the ramifications settle slowly over the country and tighten, inch by inch, wherever there is laxity. Voldemort is exquisitely well-funded, due to the general wealth of his many followers, and he has a singular talent for channeling the Death Eater's collective anger and rage into purposeful, decisive action. More than once Percy hears Voldemort smoothly, silkily, gently open a half-healed wound, point out a small injustice, twist an inconvenient truth, and convince a wizard who has never before intentionally caused harm to murder or torture or injure. More than once Percy hears Voldemort whisper insidiously about how unfair society is, how unappreciated they are, how powerful they can be, and more than once Percy finds to his horror that he believes it, just a little. Every death, every disappearance, every pompous ministry employee made to blubber with fear, every muggle killed serves to separate us versus them just a bit more, serves to make the Death Eaters feel powerful, serves to make the rest of society feel scared. It is incredibly effective, even if Percy cannot see to what end the Dark Lord is aiming. Percy suspects that he saves his real plans for his inner circle, which, as far as he can tell, consists of Snape, Lucius, Yaxley, Rookwood, Crabbe, Goyle, Nott, Macnair, and Travers. He has approximately 40 other marked members. The vast majority of his followers are bound by nothing more than fear, although Severus informs Percy via their linked notebooks that Voldemort is contemplating producing more circlets to tether the masses. "I don't understand, Severus. What does he want?" "Power, destruction, chaos. He wants to take over the ministry, of course, but through proxy leaders like Lucius and Yaxley. He has no interest in actually leading." Tom snorts when he hears this. More fool him. "When I return, my first order of business will be Hogwarts, but make no mistake, the ministry will be properly handled." Both Toms share an obsession with Hogwarts, apparently. Voldemort asks Percy about it eagerly, though he has to admit that he's not been back for many months. To Percy's surprise, he enjoys speaking about Hogwarts with the Dark Lord. After living in the castle for nearly 2 decades, he can speak of even the smallest details, and he finds that Voldemort's recall is as good as his own. Voldemort loved Hogwarts, which is a thought that always makes Percy feel a little funny inside to contemplate. Do you think he would have become him if not for Dumbledore? It is an interesting question. Perhaps he would have been content with smaller arenas. He catches sight of Narcissa Malfoy during his frequent visits to Malfoy Manor. Far from the lovely, bright woman she'd once been, this version of Narcissa is silent and cold, staring around her with wide, desperate eyes. She never speaks to Percy, but when she passes him the halls, her gaze is so arresting that he feels his throat close. Percy does not dare to go back to the Dementor, not unless he has to. The Dementor had all but admitted it didn't know how to help Percy, and Percy does not think he can justify his sudden interest in the holding cells. Anyway, Percy is a wizard, and he's trying to seek a wizard's soul. He should be able to find something, oughtn't he? And it's true, as the days pass, that Percy thinks he's getting somewhere. He can feel it in his chest, sometimes, or in the curve of his shoulders, or sometimes in the bend of his knee. Something warm, something steady, something unutterably familiar, something that he reaches for when he first transfigures back into his human form, something he recognizes as his own when he twists to links. Something that smells to him like sweet pine resin and the crackling of logs on a fire, like snapdragons in the cold spring and the crackle of leaves underfoot in the fall. Landon comes to see him, looking irritable and tired, toward the end of October. "We're moving to France," he reports unceremoniously. "Father thinks the Dark Lord will be interested in him. I think it unlikely, and anyway, I'm handling very delicate work for the ministry, since after that fiasco with the Hall of Prophecy, all of our security wards are being reset. That seems not to matter to him, though. Will you come for supper tomorrow before we leave? Percy blinks, thrown. You're leaving tomorrow. I'm not allowed to tell anyone when we are leaving, Landon says with a tense shrug, clearly unimpressed by his father's well-justified paranoia. But come, will you? Who knows when father will allow me to return to Britain? Mother's gone already, staying with my grandparents. I bloody hope that's not where we're headed to. Can you imagine? Tobias, for all his poise and grace and money, is a thrumming bundle of nerves when Percy arrives the following night. The house elf who escorts him into the main room has to clear his squeaky throat several times before Tobias looks away from where he is directing the other elves to pack up all his things. Ah, Percy, excellent, he mutters distractedly, turning back to a steady stream of expensive jewelry marching itself into a large, padlocked trunk. From the looks of it, he's emptied his entire Gringotts vault. We'll eat soon. Fetch Landon, will you? Landon is also packing, though in a significantly more desultory sort of way. In fact, it looks more as though he's enjoying the nostalgic trip through his possessions, rather than packing up his room for what could be the last time. Percy, hi, he says, noticing Percy after he lingers in the doorway for several seconds. Look at this, will you? It is a stack of student periodicals from their various years at Hogwarts. Landon points to a picture that somebody must have taken during their 4th or 5th year, of them sitting together in the great hall, talking to nearly headless Nick. Landon looks at it fondly. I really thought we'd find something, he says. At least one artifact. If only he knew. But it reminds Percy at supper. Only chicken tonight, the quail reserved for better days, to take the opportunity to ask the Greengrasses about the small inscription that had been on the mysterious ring that Dumbledore found. Tobias recognizes it right away. It's Grindelwald's symbol, of course. I thought you both got arse on history of magic. Landon and Percy exchange looks. Binns only taught us about the Goblin rebellions, Landon objects. So this was his dark mark. I do not believe he branded people with it, but certainly it became associated with him, Tobias confirms. So if it was on a ring, for example, you would say that the ring belonged to Grindelwald. Perhaps, Tobias says, raising an eyebrow at Percy. But he had many followers, and many took up the symbol as a symbol for all he stood for. Why do you ask? I am trying to find its origin, Percy says with a casual shrug. You know me, if I don't have something to research, then I get bored. Landon snorts, but Tobias looks at Percy carefully. You will not find much about it in this country. He was significantly more powerful abroad, in Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Spain. But if Dumbledore had not defeated him, doubtlessly he would have spread into Britain as well. Do you think there was a prophecy about Dumbledore and Grindelwald? Landon asks. I heard the one about Potter, and the Dark Lord smashed along with nearly 3 dozen others. Don't worry, Percy. I already looked it up, and neither you nor I have a prophecy recorded on file, though I imagine it's not too late for a seer to see our obvious brilliance. I didn't think to check Dumbledore, though, before they locked up the list. Of course, now that I'm leaving my promising career at the ministry, I shan't ever know, I suppose. Of course. Of course there was a prophecy about Dumbledore and Grindelwald. Why else would he have targeted Grindelwald when he did not even threaten Britain? Why else would he be so adamant that only Harry Potter can defeat Voldemort? Dumbledore must be operating from the same rulebook that he once followed. Percy chews slowly as he thinks through whether one of those orbs that smashed on the ground had Dumbledore's lengthy name inscribed. Perhaps, but I do not take much stock in prophecies, says Tobias. Then he throws a glance at his son. Better to be a few years delayed in your career than prematurely dead, wouldn't you say, Landon? Well, it is somewhere to start, Percy thinks to himself, as Landon snaps back a bitter rejoinder. Possibly the ring is not important, but if Dumbledore was so tempted by it to risk death, then it must have been something meaningful. Perhaps the ring was not Tom's, but rather Grindelwald's, some remnant of Dumbledore's old enmity, or a symbol of his power. Tobias clears his throat and sets down his fork. Listen, Percy. I've heard, well, I know you are in a, shall we say, precarious position, but I would like you to know that I would be pleased to shelter you in France if you wish to join us, and any of your siblings who feel similarly. I will ask only that you make a vow to not reveal the location of our house. You should use the Fidelius, says Percy. He does not automatically reject the idea. Not for him, of course, but at least for Ginny or Fred and George. I thank you for the offer, Lord Greengrass. I believe I will have to decline for myself, but I admit I see the wisdom of your suggestion for my siblings. Seems a bit unfair that he is allowed to stay in Britain, Landon says bitingly to his father. Is my career not as important as his? I am not his father, thunders Tobias, his voice suddenly stern. But if I were, I would tell him the same that I told you. You need not sacrifice yourself for a fight that is not yours. The fight is Percy's, of course. It is so much his that he sometimes has trouble imagining it as anyone else's. I cannot leave while my family is in danger, Percy says, but I thank you for the offer. Tobias looks resigned. Call on Bathelder Bagshot. If you must continue on this wretched path, you may as well do it quickly. Percy had barely known Bathelder Bagshot was alive, but Tobias explains she lives in Godric's Hollow, where Dumbledore lived and the Potters died. Be careful. Do not be seen, obviously. He goes the following week, changing his appearance to be as nondescript as he can make it. Godric's Hollow is chilly and dark. He stops by the graveyard to silently pay his respects to the Potters, though he doesn't do anything as foolish as lay flowers on their grave. Undoubtedly, he is being watched, but he has a lie prepared for that already, if any observers figure out who he is beneath the self-transfiguration. Bathelder and Aunt Muriel are old friends, or something like it. Godric's Hollow is precisely what Percy would have expected from the town where the Potters and Dumbledores settled. Quaint, pretty, well-maintained, and undeniably wealthy. There are more muggles that Percy would have expected, given the village's deep magical history, but Percy can feel the wards here, tied into the land, likely anchored into the town since Godric himself built himself a home here. It is wandering through the graveyard when he notices the sign again, etched onto the corner of Ignatus Peveril's grave. Percy had noticed it during his first visit to the graveyard, largely due to the similarity of his middle name to the man's first. But he remembers now that the Peveril family was thought, though not proven, to be related to the Gryffindor line, due to their ancient lineage and proximity to Godric's Hollow. The mark certainly cannot have originated with Grindelwald then, merely appropriated. But why? Perhaps it truly is an ancient rune, more ancient than those still in use today. It likely means something like power or blood, if Percy knows his purebloods. Bathelder Bagshot is tremendously old and very grey. She eyes him doubtfully when he raps neatly on her door, but allows him in when he reveals a yellowed photograph of Aunt Muriel, and a woman she claimed was Bathelder, though the woman in question bears very little similarity to the laughing girl with dark eyes in the photo. Tell your aunt I do not see very many people anymore, she says hoarsely, settling into the indent of a large, ornate red armchair that indicates just how much time she spends in that precise position. I will have to turn down her invitation to her birthday party. I do not like to be reminded of my age. Oh, neither does she, says Percy with a laugh that Bathelder does not return. He clears his throat and presses forward. Madam, have you lived in Godric's Hollow your entire life? Of course, she says, as if that were a tremendously stupid question. You're not here to talk about Albus, are you? I told that woman that I will not speak of him. What woman? That journalist. Rita Skeeter, presumably. Percy shakes his head. No, I care not for Dumbledore. I came merely because my aunt wished desperately for me to extend the invitation in person. I am declining, she says shortly. You may now go. Before I go, could I ask a quick question? Percy tries. I saw this symbol on a grave. I thought it was Grindelwald's symbol, but it's not, is it? Bathelder examines the drawing that Percy hands her with beady eyes. It is the symbol of the Peverils, of course, she says sharply. Do the youth not study their history any more? I, of course, read all of your books, madam, Bathelder laughs creakily. Don't pander to me, boy. It is the sign of the Peveril family of the Hallows. The Hallows. And thus it is from Bathelder Bagshot and her withering tone that Percy learns of the Deathly Hallows, a wand with impossible power, a cloak of invisibility, a stone to bring back the dead. Percy may have dismissed these as myth once, but he is well accustomed to seeing conspiracy in plots others would disregard as frivolous. And did he not once examine Harry's cloak of invisibility? He'd used the crouch cloak in the ministry, and even then he'd noticed its rough texture, the slight shimmer in the air that revealed its use. Harry's cloak is a thing of beauty. Percy wishes he'd looked at it more closely, and the connection to Grindelwald is obvious, of course. He had the wand. No wonder Dumbledore went out of his way to defeat him. There likely had been no prophecy at all. Dumbledore must have learned that Grindelwald commanded the Elder Wand, and then engineered the entire war to ensure that Dumbledore became the next recipient of its power. Presumably, Dumbledore is still the owner of the Elder Wand, which means that if all goes according to plan, so will Snape inherit its allegiance. But does it count if Dumbledore is expecting the blow? No wonder he was so desperate that Severus kill him, perhaps by arranging a suicide. Dumbledore thinks he will die as the last true owner of the Elder Wand, a fitting legacy for a vain and powerful wizard. Severus needs to defeat Dumbledore in a way Dumbledore does not expect, and then they will have the wand. As for the stone, Percy cares not for speaking with the dead, but logic would suggest the ring that Dumbledore died to obtain was likely inset with the resurrection stone. Certainly, Severus' drawing of the gem in the ring looks similar to the picture that Bathelder points to in an old tome, a dark, triangular stone with sharp, glistening edges. Suddenly, much of the opacity shielding Dumbledore's actions becomes clear. Percy wonders if Tom knows about the Deathly Hallows. Perhaps not, but Dumbledore must be trying to collect all three before his death. Does Dumbledore believe that he can cheat death? Percy is not sure what is more frightening, the thought of Tom, immortal forever, or Dumbledore. On Samhain, Percy arrives clad in his Death Eater robes and his Death Eater mask and finds himself in the middle of a massacre. He has to stop and clutch his wand tightly in his pocket, breathing heavily through his nose to contain his shock at the sight when he arrives at the apparition coordinates. The Samhain revels are not being held at Malfoy Manor, but rather in the middle of a large field, somewhere south of Wiltshire. Tom had told him to expect a significant display of magic, some revelry, the traditional ritual around the fire. This, however, is something entirely different. The field is large, bounded by great dark trees waving their spiked branches ominously in the wind. There is a fire, like Percy had expected, a massive blaze floating in the center of the space, flames of red and gold and blue and green. A tremendous cloud of smoke hangs above the fire, obstructing his vision, and though Percy had not yet been acquainted with the smell of burning flesh, he knows suddenly that the acrid stench permeating the air is precisely the smell of bodies thrown upon the pyre. There are bodies everywhere, bodies bleeding, bodies spinning in the air, bodies with mouths still screaming and limbs flailing, bodies that are still but likely still warm. And where there are bodies, there are Death Eaters, and everywhere Percy looks he sees dark cloaks and naked bodies, and gleaming white masks and blood. Blood everywhere, seeping into the crushed grass, creating a dirty, macabre pool of mud. He doesn't know how he is still standing. Percy looks around him, and he realizes a moment later that he is crying soundlessly, tears dripping from either side of his mask in a futile effort to purify the air around him. He does not know whether these bodies are muggle or wizard, friend or foe, but they are people nonetheless, and to apparate into such savagery is shocking and vile. Death Eaters to me, howls Voldemort, his voice high and wild and ecstatic. The Death Eaters, maybe 30 in total, though to Percy's panicked eyes they seem innumerable, cry and cheer in response, forming a dark circle of gleaming white masks around the fire. Percy finds himself shepherded in with the rest. Up close to the fire, the smell of bodies is even stronger, and Percy gags on the smoke, his tongue heavy and disgusting in his mouth. He is still crying, soundlessly, helplessly, and his face is twisted in perpetual disgust, his stomach heaving. The Death Eaters heave and move together, an impenetrable mass of people thrumming with the same energy and purpose. He feels like he is in a dream, sounds sliding in and out of his ears, the only sensation that feels very real, the terrible, nauseating burn of bodies turning into ash. We are denied entry into society, Voldemort bellows, and the Death Eaters boo and hiss. We are pushed to the very sides of the room. We are mocked. We are belittled. We are ignored. But tonight we are kings. Percy can't bring himself to cry out with the rest, flinching at the roar that erupts from the gathered crowd. His skin drips wetly with sweat, his eyes burning behind his glasses, and he feels the dampness of the men pressed in tightly next to him. "Oh, Merlin, what is he doing?" Voldemort's voice changes suddenly, dropping to a conversational tone that nevertheless echoes in Percy's ears as if he were standing right next to him. "Samhain is considered to be the division point in the year," he lectures, as if he were Tom standing there rather than a monster. "The point where summer, the time of the light, turns indelibly into winter, the time of darkness." His voice rises again, gathering in volume. "So too will this night mark the point when our time comes. So too will this night mark the point where we cannot be ignored any longer. We sacrifice this blood to our ancestors. We call upon our magic. We are here and we will not be forsaken any longer." Before Percy's horrified eyes, Voldemort levitates a child above the flames. The child shrieks and cries and twists wildly under the cruciatus, or something like it. But what happens next is even more awful to see. Voldemort ends the torture, and for a second all is quiet except for the quiet sobs of the child, suspended in midair. And then with a curse, the child's chest splits open, and his entrails drip down into the flames below. And suddenly Percy can bear it no longer. He stumbles away from the thickly dripping blood, from the wild screams of laughter and pain. He doesn't belong here. He's not a killer or a spy or even a hero. He's nothing more than an arrogant swot, good-natured but uptight, capable but vain. He never should have taken on this burden. He never should have twisted himself through time. He should be trying to date girls, or working toward a promotion, or at the very least hiding with his family. Not here, not with the twin deaths of a muggle and a witch on his hands, not with a Dark Lord in his apartment, and a Dark Lord in his head, and a Dark Lord in front of him, laughing with wild and reckless glee as he twists his wand in his pale, white hands. When had he last been that boy? Had he killed him too when he started the ritual? Had it begun when Fred had first died? Or had the death of Percy Weasley happened slowly, insidiously, every time Percy pushed forward the line that separates good intentions from unforgivable actions? First, he'd been afraid of dark magic, and then he'd worked up the courage to try it, and then he'd written to Tom, and now all of his actions have buried him brick by brick inside a furnace of his own making. Gasping, crying, he threads his way unsteadily out of the fray, barely making it to the small copse of trees at the edge of the clearing before retching violently, his body slick and shivering. "It will pass," says a voice. Percy looks up, his mouth full of the taste of blood and vomit, his glasses smudged, his eyes wide and staring, and Severus is above him, looking tremendously sad, even under his shining, bone-white mask. He holds out a hand. When Percy takes it, they vanish, and appear on the river bank, under the same wide branches of the oak tree. Percy drops to his knees and retches again, but nothing comes up, only the unstoppable urge to rid his stomach of the evil inside it. Percy hesitates. He told Severus his secret all those years ago because he'd had to, because he'd not wanted to be alone, and now he regrets it. If Severus weren't there to observe him, Percy would just disappear, run away, kill himself, even so as not to suffer through this torment any longer. "I can't do this anymore. You have to finish it for me." "You can," says Severus simply, still extending a hand, though Percy is still shaking on the ground. "You feel as though you do not recognize yourself. Perhaps what you know has saved lives. All you know are the lives that you have taken. Whatever you thought you were before no longer exists, and you cannot hope to see what you may be when the dust settles around you. I can't do this anymore, Severus. You will do it because it needs to be done," thunders Snape more strongly than before. "I have done it. You will do it. And together we will do what needs to be done. That is who we are, Percy. That is who we will be when the dust clears. We will not be heroes. Likely we will not be alive, but we will have done our duty." "Why didn't you obliviate me?" Percy asks with a hiccuping gasp. "Or tell Dumbledore all those years ago? You gave me hope again," Severus says simply, raising an eyebrow. "And perhaps I was just sentimental enough to believe you deserved to see your redemption through." Percy hiccups out a laugh, like Severus is ever sentimental. "I have no hope now." "You do, you silly boy. We know 4 of 6. We are nearly done. If you falter now, you will regret it for all of your days." "How do you know?" Severus looks at Percy, and his pain is so raw, so aching, that Percy's throat closes with the impact of it. "I overheard the prophecy about the boy who lived," he whispers. "I gave it to him, and he killed her." Percy tries to imagine that, tries to imagine if one day he were to know someone he loved had died, and it had been directly his fault. He can imagine it easily, and the idea makes him sway unsteadily. He sits back on his haunches and stares, eyes wide open, at Severus. Severus gives a mirthless laugh. "I saw the death of your brother in your mind," he whispers. "I felt what you felt. You cannot falter now, Percy, or I promise you that you will regret it for the rest of your life, and you cannot turn yourself in time again." Percy wipes his tears and gets to his feet shakily. "I'm sorry. You cannot do that again." "I'm sorry for you," Percy clarifies. He inhales slowly and looks around him at the familiar dirty riverbank, gleaming and oily in the scarce moonlight. The fishy smell of the water lapping against the shore does very little to clear the scent of burning flesh from his nostrils. He knows, without guessing, that he will see that child in his dreams for the rest of his life and smell the stench of his death for the rest of his days. But he can focus on the familiarity of the river and desperately shove away his horror. "You said that this was your redemption. It's a pretty shitty redemption, if you're asking me." Severus looks at him incredulously before his face closes in, forbidding. "Excuse me." Percy waves his hand, encompassing the horror they had just left behind. "All of this. So you sold a secret to the Dark Lord. So Lily Evans died because of it. I imagine you did not know what impact your words would have at the time. You turned spy for Dumbledore because of it. You had to redeem yourself. I understand that, Severus, trust me, I do, but I think your debt has been paid many times over." "My debt will never be paid," says Severus quietly. "That's foolish." Percy shakes his head, his throat still raw from the smoke and the scream and the tears, but the argument with Severus giving him something to anchor himself on. "You told Dumbledore about the prophecy, didn't you? And he hid Lily and James under the Fidelius, and they would have been perfectly fine if they had trusted, say, McGonagall as their secret keeper instead of Pettigrew. It was a prophecy, Severus. If you had not told the Dark Lord, maybe it would not have come to pass, but if you had not told Dumbledore, Lily wouldn't have had time to prepare." "She was not prepared to die, Weasley," Severus exclaims tightly. "Wasn't she?" Percy risks, hearing the cry of this poor child as its death arrived without warning. Where was its mother? What would its mother have wanted to do, given the time? "She did something to Harry, Severus. She cast powerful blood wards over him. She had to have time to research those and reason to believe that she would die, and love enough to want her death to protect her son. Those blood wards have been protecting him for the last 15 years. Isn't that what we think? And if Harry hadn't survived that night, he wouldn't be the chosen one, and the Dark Lord wouldn't be vulnerable. But if I had said nothing at all, but if you had said nothing, then what, Severus? The Order was losing the war. I know this, and you know this, and Dumbledore knows this. Why was the Order full of 20-year-old wizards, even then? Because all the older ones were dead. I know what this war is going to look like in a year, let alone in 5. Imagine if Harry hadn't defeated the Dark Lord, and he would have continued growing in strength, unchecked. Imagine if Dumbledore had tried to face him and lost. We would have all been lost, Severus. Your actions killed Lily Evans, but think of how many years of peace we had in exchange. Now we have Harry, and he's a petulant teenager, but we know that in 2 years' time he does something and he kills the Dark Lord. I saw it myself. Do you really think Lily would have preferred the alternative? She would have been targeted anyway, for being such a brilliant mudblood. "Do not say that word," hisses Snape, and Percy flinches into silence. He stares down at his muddy shoes, not wanting to risk Severus' ire. They are all the victims of fate, of circumstance, of their own inconsequential decisions. If Percy had been sorted Ravenclaw, if he had not been accepted as Crouch's apprentice, and instead worked with his father, if he had been less proud, if he had not made a joke right then as Fred stepped into that curse, if he had not opened that one book with the time ritual, if he had not befriended the Muggle-born librarian at the Library of Archives, if he had not had the courage to end his first life, everything would have been different, and who's to say he made the right choice? When it becomes clear that Severus is not going to say anything, Percy clears his throat. He reaches inside his bag, the book bag he keeps on him at all times. "I have something for you." The shock on Severus' face is tinged red by the opulent sparkle of the Philosopher's Stone. Percy had retrieved it from Gringotts several days ago, planning on using it to create more gold, given his supply was nearly out. He hadn't planned to give it to Severus, But somehow this seems like the correct thing to do, and he says without hesitation, "I want you to have this to protect you." "You snake," says Severus, but with something closer to delight than to disparagement if Percy squinted and examined the words closely. "You stole this right under Albus' nose, didn't you? All I ask in exchange is you give me some of the gold," says Percy, thrusting the stone towards Severus. Severus doesn't take it. "And how is this meant to keep me safe?" "It confers immortality, I believe," says Percy, pushing himself to his feet. "I imagine it has several protective properties, and you're the best person to discover them." "Percy," says Severus slowly and clearly, "this is the Philosopher's Stone. You cannot just gift it to me like a book you thought I may be interested in." "Why not?" Percy protests. "I have no use for it, save that I am poor, particularly after giving so much money to Dumbledore. You are the potion's master. I would think you have the best chance of extracting value out of this." Severus is clearly mesmerized by the stone, by the subtle way it absorbs the meager light and reflects it back to them. "And you do not worry I would be tempted?" "No," says Percy simply. "And if you are tempted by immortality, I reckon you deserve it, given you have spent 2 lifetimes already trying to earn your redemption." This time, Severus takes the stone, carefully, and holds it as if it were a delicate egg. "Thank you," he says fiercely, and Percy is taken aback by the strength of the other man's emotion. Then more calmly, as if embarrassed by his outburst, Severus clears his throat and posits, "But you are not interested in your own immortality." Percy thinks for a second about it, measures the weight of his 2 lifetimes against the concept of a third, and shakes his head. "I just want to live this life," he admits, "but properly, without the Dark Lord. But you're going to be in incredible danger over the next year, Severus. I want you to have this." "I have known my death is imminent for years," Severus says quietly, securing the stone away in his robes. "Your arrival and subsequent knowledge merely confirmed it." He does not continue, but Percy can fill in the gaps himself. Perhaps with the stone, Severus can escape that fate, which Percy imagines is both a great and terrible idea to contemplate. To spare him, Percy changes the topic. With each passing second, the smell of the river seems to clear the flames from his throat and nose, and he is able to think more clearly, as if the horror he had left behind had been a dream, and he'd awoken, gasping and sweating, into the safety of his bed. "I think Dumbledore has the Elder Wand. You need to defeat him properly. We need to surprise him." Severus is silent, and then to Percy's surprise the other man lets out something that may be the beginnings of a grim laugh. "We have to keep going, Severus," Percy says, now parroting the other man's words back to him. "Your redemption is done, believe it or not, but it will certainly be done when we kill the sick bastard. It'll be easier with the Elder Wand." "Well, I am glad you have recovered from your shock," Severus says dryly, and by mutual agreement they part ways without discussing the question of anyone's redemption any further. November 1996, but Percy doesn't recover quickly, not really. November brings with it more death and destruction, and Percy finds himself increasing the dosage of dreamless sleep that he takes, just to have a few hours without the smell of burning flesh in his nostrils, as he sleeps fitfully in his small, cramped room. Scrimgeour's face grows lined and aged as the full burden of the war settles more solidly on his shoulders, and even Moody looks more tired than paranoid when Percy passes him in the halls. In this timeline, Scrimgeour rises to the occasion much more than he had previously, or perhaps Percy is remembering the past incorrectly. Scrimgeour tries. Forearms are checked at entrance, but when Percy hides his under a very strong concealing charm that he can only maintain for a few minutes at a time, somehow the Dark Lord finds out and forces Percy to teach the spell to the others. Guards patrol the halls. Everyone must complete a mandatory training in defense. He reorganizes departments, publishes helpful pamphlets, and gives daily speeches where he provides updates on casualties and protective measures. But none of it is enough. Voldemort gives his followers instructions only to cause chaos, and the lack of clear motive, the seemingly random nature of attack, the ubiquity of masked young men that are sighted at the scene all contribute to make it feel like the Ministry is fighting against a deadly smoke, impossible to catch in its fingers. Even when they do take prisoners, none of the prisoners know anything about the Dark Lord, save that they may have been recruited by a hooded Death Eater with a disguised voice. There are far more of these angry young wizards than there are marked Death Eaters. Because Percy is excluded from the inner circle meetings, he finds to his dismay he does not have much intelligence to pass to McGonagall. He can name the marked Death Eaters, and he's learned quite a bit about the various attacks, but he frequently only learns about them after the fact. Whatever Severus knows is undoubtedly more useful than the gossip and rumor that Percy dutifully encodes with a clever charm he'd invented and sends via Cedric or Tonks to McGonagall. Cedric shocks everyone by loudly criticizing Dumbledore in the Three Broomsticks in order to give himself an excuse to speak to Percy, and so they are actually able to grab tea every few weeks without drawing too much attention to themselves. Cedric is a wealthy, pure-blooded wizard, and Barty's paranoia seemed to suggest he hadn't widely shared that he'd killed Cedric's father, so Percy is not even questioned about this friendship by the Dark Lord, nor any of his followers. Cedric seems to be taking Severus' instructions to remind Percy of his purpose quite literally, and Percy often finds himself speaking more candidly about his frustration with his continued estrangement with his family than he means to reveal. "Tell me about the Diggory boy," says Voldemort, interested, and Percy has to repress a shudder at the thought of Voldemort's frigid attention on Cedric's open, smiling face. "He's only a Hufflepuff, and he's a bit dull," says Percy hastily, "but he certainly holds no love for Dumbledore. He's quite angry about Dumbledore pushing Potter to the forefront of the Triwizard Tournament and depriving Diggory of the chance to win fame and glory for himself. Perhaps you ought to cultivate him. I would be happy to, if that is what my lord desires, but I do not think he will be a great addition to our ranks, my lord." "Dumbledore's a bloody fool," Scrimgeour says bitterly one evening toward the middle of the month. He and Percy are, for once, alone in the dark and silent office. It is a sad day. 2 from their office were killed in a blast in Diagon Alley. Percy grunts in agreement. He is writing 2 letters of condolences to their families, but the sheer senselessness of the incident. They'd been doing something normal for once, merely checking on the permits of the few remaining vendors in Diagon Alley, and had entirely by accident been caught in the explosion. "I know he knows something," Scrimgeour gripes. "Something about Potter, something about you-know-who. I understand him needing to keep a secret to the public. But to me, the minister, why does he not trust me?" The Muggle PM's ringing our office, asking about all the Muggles that are disappearing, and I have to admit to him I don't know anything because a ruddy schoolmaster is holding his secrets too close to his chest. "Dumbledore does not trust anyone." "You say that as if it were admirable," Scrimgeour scoffs. "We are at war, and it is us versus them. Why does he spurn our help? We may have different methods, but they are by no means incompatible. In fact, I would argue it is good for us to have different methods. Why aren't we put all our eggs in one nest?" Percy hums in neutral agreement and scratches out a few more lines praising the ministry employees for their heroics. "Why do you need him, sir? Look around you, Weasley. We are dying every day. We do not know when he will attack, or why, or how. Whether Dumbledore or Potter is our generation's chosen one remains to be seen, but either way we need one of them." "Well, what do you actually need?" Percy presses as he signs his name beneath one letter and tries to work up the courage for the second. "Men, wands, money, information." Scrimgeour thunders so loudly that Percy checks nervously that the wards are still thrumming around them. What is he doing? What does he want? Chaos. He brings himself back from the dead to sow chaos in Britain. Scrimgeour shakes his head. "He's planning something, Weasley." Percy checks the wards again and then lowers his voice. "Well, you know he wants to infiltrate the ministry. Why don't you infiltrate his ranks? You know the type of man he's recruiting. You think I have not tried? Not a Death Eater, just someone on the outside who might be able to one day be on the inside. Weasley. Or if you can't stop them from coming then, at least make it harder for them to win," he continues doggedly. "Freeze any Death Eater or suspected Death Eater's vaults. Hide the instructions from one minister to his successor. You know, if he takes control, then he'll target the Muggle-borns, try and get them to safety now, while we're still in charge. Once he takes over, the Death Eaters will be everywhere openly. Make a plan now for how we will track them back to the Dark Lord." "You'll wash your hands of us so quickly," Scrimgeour says gruffly. "I am nothing if not pragmatic," says Percy dryly. Sometimes it feels like he's the only pragmatic one in the entire bloody wizarding world. Listen, Minister, we are lucky that the Dark Lord wants nothing more than to sow chaos right now. We need to act. We need to prepare for the worst. Scrimgeour is silent for a long time, stroking his tawny beard and watching Percy struggle through the second letter. The Dark Lord, he says finally. I'm sorry. You call him the Dark Lord. I will not say his name, Percy says with a strained smile. But to call him you know who seems. The Dark Lord, repeats Scrimgeour. He shakes his head. He looks acutely as though he needs a glass of whiskey, something to take a long, pensive sip from before slamming the glass down on the table. You're right. We're fooling ourselves to believe we'll win this war. Best we can do is die with grace. It is worth it to try, isn't it? Percy asks quietly. Even if you feel doomed to fail. Scrimgeour gives a heavy sigh and stands. He looks at Percy for a long moment as if he will reply, but after another gusty sigh, all he does is walk away. But buried between item 32 and 33 on Percy's weekly list of tasks, a habit Scrimgeour started, which Fudge never would have even considered. He asks Percy to compile a list of high-risk individuals. Percy stares at it, feeling cold. The Dark Lord would want this list. He would likely kill Percy if he knew Percy made this list for the minister, but did not report it. But he can't help himself. He has to make the list, because if the minister has not given up, then he will respect that, if he can. The ranks of the ministry are thinning anyway. There are less dangerous professions. Even if Scrimgeour is publicly unwilling to admit that they are losing the war, most of the population can read the signs. What will the Dark Lord do when he has the ministry at his command, when Harry Potter is finally vanquished? What will he do when all of the Muggleborns have been killed, and his hordes of Snatchers are baying for blood? How will he fill his days? Will he spread his oily reach over the rest of the continent? Will he refuse to stop until he has conquered the entire world? It makes me nervous, the waiting. He overhears one of his coworkers muttering to another. It's like he's toying with us. Perhaps the Dark Lord is using the time for something, but even Tom cannot explain precisely what. He spends hours seemingly alone in Malfoy Manor completing complex rituals. Elemental magic, Tom says shortly, his face pale and drawn. He's killing us. He thinks the earth will give him power, but he's killing us, the bloody fool. He's scared of something, but I don't know what. Surely it's not the Potter boy. Every time Percy goes back to Malfoy Manor, the heavy taint of the Dark Lord's magic is stronger. Percy takes his own advice and arranges his affairs in order. His will, of course, has laid securely in the Prewett vault since he was 17. He takes out as much gold as he thinks he can afford without raising the ire of Aunt Muriel, particularly since Severus manages to slip him a heavy pouch of gold. He writes a list of explicit instructions and leaves vials of memories for his family members, in case they need to complete the task if he dies. He purchases large amounts of potions' ingredients and casts strong preserving charms on them. He purchases large numbers of healing potions and saves them in unbreakable vials. And he purchases 3 well-provisioned wizarding tents and places them in different locations for emergency use. The next weekend, Percy spends what would almost be an enjoyable few hours with Tonks, assembling emergency kits to distribute to the members of the Order, if it were not for the grim urgency that underlies each action. Establishing a network of safe houses, Percy finds, is precisely the type of task he enjoys. Complicated and precise, each with a set of specific opportunities and challenges to consider for optimal success. The Order must buy or otherwise take control of a series of houses in both Muggle and Wizarding neighborhoods, outfit each with the proper equipment, and establish each as a distinct but connected entity. Percy flatly refuses to use Ferdelius, which he thinks will be too rigid for their purposes. Far better for 1 or 2 houses to fall due to insufficient protections than for the whole operation to end because some idiot secret keeper gets himself killed in the war. He personally enchants a series of portkeys, which Moody assigns to a squad of his own to provision as needed. Each allows access only to their chosen house, and none of the houses have any sort of identifying information to link to another. Each house also includes instructions on how to create an international portkey, though they do not suggest where the occupants of the house may try and flee. Better to not have an established route to disrupt. It is not too difficult to perform these actions under the close watch of Yaxley, assigned to shadow him at the ministry, though Percy is careful to only go to headquarters when Tom is away. Percy has invented an entire fake girlfriend to explain his absences, a witch loosely based off of an amalgamation of Myrtle and Penny, though pure-blooded, of course. But Tom never asks. Percy tries not to be hurt that Tom does not seem to notice where Percy is when he is not in his flat. Really, he ought to be relieved. Still, the Dark Lord is away for much of November, which provides a necessary cooling relief after the sharp burn of Samhain. Even Yaxley seems a little rattled in the weeks that follow the carnage. Yaxley is a slick, smarmy-looking fellow with long white hair and a long, pointed nose, a clear imitation of Lucius Malfoy, though one with undeniably less presence. Percy thinks that Yaxley might be able to capitalize on his ability to fade into the background, except that Yaxley so clearly wishes to be in the thick of things that he shoulders himself into the forefront at every opportunity. Certainly, he enjoys nosing around Scrimgeour's office, bringing Percy lunch, and interrogating him openly about the movements of the minister. Percy allows this, partially because he often is unable to procure lunch himself, and Yaxley brings him food packed by his house elf, rather than the cheap ministry meals that once provided so much reassurance to Percy, and that he now hates fervently, and partially because Percy knows perfectly well that Yaxley reports back to the Dark Lord at every opportunity. Scrimgeour has noticed Yaxley too, but many people seem to think plying Percy with gifts is an appropriate way to spy on the minster, and so Percy doubts Scrimgeour pays Yaxley particular attention. Percy obediently reports on Scrimgeour's movements, or at least the more public ones, and adds in a few derogatory comments about Scrimgeour as a blood traitor, incompetent sard, etc., as the occasion merits. He does mention Scrimgeour's feud with Dumbledore, which seems to interest either Yaxley or the Dark Lord, given as Yaxley asks him eagerly for updates on it at every opportunity. Percy does not have much to report on that front, though he winds elaborate stories out of it anyway, highlighting that Scrimgeour seems too cowardly to make any moves without Dumbledore's approval, and Dumbledore seems to take pleasure in blocking Scrimgeour, secure in his arrogant view that he does not need the Minister of Magic to win the war. Tom enjoys hearing these stories too, when he's around, so Percy has a suspicion so will the Dark Lord. On Christmas, Percy is forced to return to the burrow by a persistent Scrimgeour, who does not seem willing to listen to Percy's explanations that he is estranged from his family. They are all Dumbledores, Percy says clearly and deliberately to the minister, already planning how he will explain this to Yaxley. Percy operates off the assumption that the Dark Lord will learn nearly everything about what Percy does in public, that is, everywhere except headquarters and in the privacy of his own flat, and so often preemptively admits to fault to avoid being caught in a deception. They will not help you, and they most certainly will not help me. I promise you that. Worth a shot, Scrimgeour says gruffly. I want to meet the little boy hero anyway. See what kind of man he is. That'll be Percy's angle too, he decides. Surely the Dark Lord can't fault him for wanting to see how Harry Potter turns out. This goes just about the same way it does the first time, save that Marley is decidedly cool to him and does not run after him, crying. He supposes this helps him avoid an uncomfortable scene, but he does miss the days when his mother cared about his happiness. His father, on the other hand, lays his hand on his shoulder and invites him to stay for supper. Percy refuses on principle, though the sight of his father shocks him. He is thin and wan, looking far worse than he did the previous time Percy sighted him, and his hair has turned almost entirely white. Is it the remnants of the venom? Is it Percy's life ward? His stomach turns coldly with the thought. Back home, Percy collapses on the couch after preparing himself a gin and tonic. He does not drink alcohol really ever, but he thinks such a terrible Christmas warrants at least one glass. Enchanting the wireless to play Celestina Warbeck, he ignores the small voice in his head that wants to cry at the thought of what he is doing. He pulls out his notebook to wish Severus a happy Christmas. He pauses after flipping to the page he uses to talk to Severus. He's barely communicated with the other man since Samhain. Severus had left the pouch of gold in Regulus' room, but not included a note. But Percy has grown frustrated. He has but a few friends his own physical age, and then Severus around his own mental age, and then McGonagall and Aunt Muriel. He cannot afford to let awkwardness ruin one of those precious relationships. Happy Christmas, Severus. I hope you can eke out a measure of calm today. He closes the notebook, not expecting a reply, but later on, when Percy is sitting in front of the empty portrait and debating making himself another drink, the notebook grows warm in his pocket. Happy Christmas, Percy. Percy gapes at the spiky handwriting, feeling absurdly like he wants to take a photograph. Then more words appear, not bloody likely. Yours. Terrible, Percy writes back quickly. S brought me to the burrow. Mum looked like she wanted to kill me herself. Dad is looking really ill. The venom. I hope not. I will try and contrive a reason to see him. This makes Percy feel even warmer than the sight of his given name in Severus' handwriting. Perhaps he has not lost the other man's respect. Perhaps he has even gained a friend, as ludicrous as the idea is to contemplate.